All right, good evening. It is time to finish off this Thomas Sowell book. So, I'm going to jump right on into it. It's a long chapter again, so I'm probably going to have to take a break somewhere in between to refill my water at least once. Um, but yeah, let's just start right up. So, the last chapter of Affirmative Action Around the World is chapter 7, titled The Past and the Future. If studying history is one way to avoid repeating it, there is much in the history of affirmative action policies around the world that should never be repeated. In too many countries, such policies have turned out to be ways of producing relatively minor benefits for a few and major problems for society as a whole. Both advocates and critics of such policies have tended to overestimate the benefits that have been transferred. Moreover, the distribution of benefits from group preferences and quotas often shows the same disparities as the broader social inequalities which they are supposed to be remedying. Allowing black millionaires in the United States to have preferential access to the purchase of radio station licenses does not reduce inequality among Americans, nor does it benefit people living in ghettos. Affirmative action does little for the poor in America as elsewhere. The poverty rate among blacks was cut in half before there was affirmative action and has changed very little since then. Whatever the peculiarities of particular countries, the general patterns which have emerged in one country after another strongly suggest that similar incentives and constraints tend to produce similar consequences among human beings in widely disparate circumstances. The fact that so many of these consequences were not anticipated by those who promoted group preferences creates a painful contrast with the confident and sweeping assertions with which such policies were often begun. Those who thought that they were directing the course of events often discovered that they had simply opened the floodgates and that events were taking a course far different from what had been envisioned. The spread of preferences from group to group and from activity to activity is just one symptom of the floodgates being open. The whole mindset behind preferences and quotas has spread as well. France has passed a law requiring political parties to have equal numbers of male and female candidates. In Pakistan, places have been reserved in educational institutions for the children of sportsmen, military officers, government employees, attorneys, doctors, and university employees. The American Society of Newspaper Editors keeps statistics on the percentage of minority journalists out to 2 decimal points, lamenting a decline in journalists of color from 11.86% to 11.64% in 1 year, and expressing satisfaction when this rose again to 12.07% a year later. Too often, sweeping assumptions about the past and sweeping assertions about the future have served as substitutes for the difficult task of analyzing hard facts. These facts include a bitter history of escalating intergroup violence where affirmative action has existed longest, in India, an outright civil war in Sri Lanka. There has also been a moral dimension to these illusions, namely the assumption that we can compensate individuals today for what was done to groups in the past, that we can make right among the living the wrongs done to people long dead. Galling as it may be to acknowledge every evil of past generations and past centuries will remain. Wait a minute, sorry. Galling as it may be to acknowledge every evil of past generations and past centuries will remain indelibly and irrevocably evil despite anything that we can do now. Acts of symbolic expiation among the living simply create new evils. The illusion of compensation for disadvantages, too, often ignores the reality that those individuals most likely to be compensated are often those with the least disadvantages, even when the groups they come from may suffer misfortunes. In Pakistan, for example, quotas favoring people from the less developed districts of the country turned out to favor, quote, the relatively well-off candidate from both backward and developed regions, end quote. Conversely, those individuals who end up being sacrificed for the sake of symbolic expiation are likely to be the least advantaged of the non-preferred population, even if that population as a whole may be more fortunate than the group that has been given preferences. Those whites displaced from admission to elite American colleges when blacks are admitted with lower qualifications are unlikely to be named Rockefeller or Vanderbilt, and are more likely to be named Bake or Grutter. The same pattern can be found in other countries. When affirmative action was instituted in Bombay to increase the number of Maharashtrians among business executives there. The biggest losses of these executive positions were not among the dominant Gujaratis, but among the less represented South Indians. In Malaysia, the requirement that businesses take in Malay partners was more easily circumvented by the larger Chinese and foreign firms. Quote, both Chinese and foreign companies began to actively solicit business ties with politically influential Malays willing to lend their names for a price without taking an executive roles after becoming owners and directors of the companies. Small, predominantly manufacturing enterprises which were not privy to such avenues to bypass the state were those most affected by the government's new constraints. End quote. The vocabulary of affirmative action. Failure to come to grips with the actual consequences of affirmative action policies has been due not only to an unfamiliarity with the history of such policies or to a dearth of statistics in a particular country, but is also due to words and conceptions which obscure and confuse the desirability that obscure and confuse. That was the end of the sentence. The desirability of one policy versus another cannot even be discussed seriously when words have chameleon-like changes in meaning during the course of a discussion. Such expressions as a level playing field, quote unquote, can have diametrically opposite meanings when no distinction is made between performance differences and favoritism. Whether one advocates or opposes affirmative action, its consequences have been too serious to be ignored, or hidden behind a fog of words with vague and shifting meanings. Blurring distinctions. In the context of affirmative action, blurring the distinction between the preference differences and favoritism serves the political purpose of providing a rationale for government intervention with preferences and quotas for particular groups as ways of offsetting the supposed favoritism or advantages enjoyed by other groups. However, if we are serious about wanting to confront realities, then our vocabulary cannot confuse performance differences with favors or disadvantages. The expression a level playing field cannot mean both, number one, having the same performance receive the same evaluation or reward regardless of the group from which the individual comes, and number two, equal outcomes or equal statistical probabilities for success for different groups. It is a matter of semantic preferences which of these definitions one chooses, but it is a matter of simple clarity and honesty not to choose both, nor to drift back and forth between these very different concepts in the course of a discussion. Where it is clear that those whom one is addressing mean the first and the expression is used to mean the second, then that is sheer deceit. And we're in an ad. Okay. Thought it was going to start. That's why I was sort of hesitant there. So I'll just back up a sentence when we come back. Hey man, hey Vesper, how you doing? Glad to see you come in. I don't know if you can hear me right now. I will answer you again when we're out of an ad, which should be in 9 seconds. There we go. It says we're back. Hey, Vesper, how's it going? I'm glad to see you made it back in. You said you're going to try, so I'm glad to see you made it. We're only like 2 pages into the chapter, and it's a fairly long one. So, yeah, I'm just going to back up one sentence here because I think it just cut off the end of the sentence going into the ad. It is a matter of semantic preferences which of these definitions one chooses, but it is a matter of simple clarity and honesty not to choose both, nor to drift back and forth between these very different concepts in the course of a discussion. Where it is clear that those whom one is addressing mean the first and the expression is used to mean the second, then that is sheer deceit. Among advocates of affirmative action, the phrase a level playing field has often been used to describe not even-handed rules applied to all, but a deliberate tilting of the rules to produce a preconceived equalizing of results. These shifting definitions serve to evade facts which challenge the central dogma behind many discussions of discrimination and affirmative action, namely, that statistical differences between groups are due to how others treat these groups, not due to differences in the performances of the groups themselves. Yet all around the world there are performance differences among groups. People from higher socioeconomic classes tend to score higher on mental tests, whether in China, the Philippines, or the United States. People from some geographic settings tend to score higher than people from other geographic settings. Indonesians from the island of Java have scored higher than Indonesians from the outer islands. Filipinos from Manila have scored higher than Filipinos from other parts of the country. Pakistanis from the Punjab score higher than people from other parts of Pakistan. And Tamils from the Jaffna Peninsula consistently outscored the Sinhalese, who predominate in the rest of the country. In the United States, regional differences in mental test scores among soldiers tested during the First World War sometimes outweighed even racial differences, as whites in some southern states scored lower than blacks from some northern states. Indeed, test score differences between different generations of the same people have in various countries been greater than those between black and white Americans. In countries where there are minority students who have dramatically outperformed students from the majority population, which controls the educational institutions, as in Sri Lanka and Malaysia, then clearly this is not a matter of discrimination or bias. Nor can the above average incomes of Japanese Americans be attributed to any ability on their part to discriminate or otherwise get an advantage over white Americans. Superior economic performances by minorities have been common around the world, not just in the countries studied here. Germans in Russia, Armenians in Turkey, Lebanese in West Africa, Italians in Brazil, Indians in Fiji, and Jews throughout Eastern Europe have been just some of the minorities who have excelled economically without any ability to discriminate against the majority populations of these countries. In short, the automatic dismissal of evidence that one group performs better or worse than another by blaming test bias, covert racism, or other such convenient explanations may sound plausible within the confines of one country, but not against the background of large and numerous performance differences in countries around the world. Groups are often said to be excluded from various institutions or activities because they do not meet the qualifications for those institutions or activities as often as members of some other groups do, or do not perform as well in these institutions or activities. But when the Malays are referred to as a deprived group in Malaysia, and non-Malays are having privilege, it would seem that surely no one really means that there are either legal rights of a lesser nature for Malays or economic activities which anyone can prevent Malays from engaging in within Malaysia. Yet it is hard to know whether such statements represent only current verbal fashions or a serious belief about the real world. especially when a writer for the British newspaper The Guardian described the situation before the new economic policy in Malaysia this way. Quote, Malays were on the sidelines in their own society with hardly any place in economic life, little role in the media, and not much more in intellectual and academic life. So action which would normally be inadmissible, interventions in the economic, cultural, and education sphere to give Malays a chance to catch up ought to be permitted. Foreign firms and governments which blocked Malay progress could be similarly treated. End quote. When others are said to have blocked the progress of Malays in Malaysia, the clear implication seems to be that the outcome was due to what others did rather than to what the Malays did not do. In other words, this implies that it was not any lack of skills, experience, or other capabilities on the part of the Malays which was responsible for their not ending up with the same achievements as others in Malaysia. But if this was meant as a serious statement about the real world, there was no attempt to specify just what this blocking consisted of. No doubt there are reasons why one group excels over others in particular fields, nor are these reasons necessarily innate or due to personal merit. The Tamils in Sri Lanka, for example, were in colonial times educated in American missionary schools that emphasized mathematics and science more so than the British missionary schools in which the Sinhalese were educated. The Chinese who immigrated to Malaysia came from circumstances in southern China that had long made hard work and frugality necessary for survival, while the Malay culture developed in easier circumstances, permitting an easier going way of life. Much the same distinction could be made between the Indians who settled in Fiji and the indigenous Fijians, I guess. Many other influences may have been behind other differences between other groups in other countries, but that does not make those differences any less real or automatically make them simply results of discrimination by others. Words can confuse the vagaries of fate with the sins of man. Philosophically, we might regard it as unjust in some cosmic sense that one group was better prepared for a particular kind of competition than other groups, even if its advantage consisted only of prior adversity. However, such a conception might be debated in the abstract around a seminar table. The empirical question in public policy issues is whether one group outperforms another or is simply rewarded more for the same or less performances. At the very least, these are different questions, even if these differences are blurred or confused by words and phrases about one group's greater access, advantages, opportunity, and the like. A common complaint in countries around the world is that some groups have less access to credit, making it harder for them to start businesses or to buy homes, for example. Yet, both government programs and private lending organizations have suffered devastating losses when lending to groups who are said to have been denied access to credit in a market economy. In Malaysia, for example, quote, of the 55,000 loans that had been given to Malay businesses, only 6,000 had been paid back, end quote. In the United States, when the Bank of America set up a special subsidiary to lend to people in the subprime market, quote unquote, that is, people with lower credit ratings, it lost hundreds of millions of dollars and announced that its offices, quote, will stop making subprime loans immediately, end quote. When people with a track record of not repaying loans as often as others are not granted loans as often as others, or not at as low an interest rate as others, is that a denial of equal opportunity or a reflection of unequal prospects of repayment? When those students or workers do not perform as well as others wait. I'm confused by this sentence. Sorry. When those students or workers who do not perform as well as others do not advance as well as others, does this mean a lack of access beforehand or a lack of achievement afterward? These are not semantic questions, but questions about the real world. Beclouding the realities of these situations with tendentious words does not facilitate determining either causes or cures. The widely accepted doctrine that prior favoritism predetermines the future likewise cannot withstand scrutiny. The clear favoritism of the British colonial government is providing free education to Malays did not prevent the Chinese from excelling the Malays in education, either during colonial times or in the first decades after independence. Only affirmative action preferences and quotas enabled Malays to increase their share of places in the universities. Moreover, even this quantitative increase did not lead to a sufficient qualitative performance to satisfy the Malay government, which began to take steps to allow other groups to enter university programs needed to supply scientific and technical skills that the Malays still failed to supply. Hiding Asian success. Not only particular facts, but whole groups of people have been hidden behind a fog of words. For example, in the Bowenbach study of affirmative action in higher education in the United States, black students admitted to American colleges under lower standards have been hidden within a larger group of black students, which included those who met the same standards of admission as white students. Although the Bowenbach study has been widely accepted as proving that affirmative action works, those for whom it supposedly works are never allowed to appear alone anywhere in the voluminous statistics presented in that study. The performances of those blacks admitted under the same standards as whites prove nothing about affirmative action. Many other statistical comparisons of blacks and whites by those supporting affirmative action policies often omit other ethnic groups whose data are readily available and whose experience might serve as a check on theories about the causes of the black-white differences. If the central premise of affirmative action is that groups cannot on their own rise to parity in American society when they have a history of poverty and low occupational status and are indelibly different in skin color than the history of Chinese Americans or Japanese Americans might be relevant to testing this belief empirically, since both groups have in fact done what has been said to be impossible. At the beginning of the 20th century, Japanese immigrants were agricultural laborers and domestic servants to an even greater extent than the blacks. It was only after the Second World War that the younger generation of Japanese Americans went into very different occupations and rose up the socioeconomic ladder. By 1979, Japanese American males had higher incomes than white American males. Current socioeconomic differences between blacks and whites, which are routinely ascribed to racial discrimination or cultural bias, might look very different if data were examined showing that Asian Americans often have the same advantages, quote unquote, over whites that whites have over blacks. For example, whites' applications for home mortgages are approved at a higher rate than those of blacks, but applications from Asian Americans are approved at a higher rate than those of whites. Blacks tend to lose their jobs during an economic downturn more often than whites, but whites are more likely to lose their jobs than are Asian Americans. The fact that whites score higher than blacks on the mathematics SAT has been taken as proof of the cultural bias of this test, but the fact that Asian Americans score higher than whites has been passed over in silence. Higher infant mortality rates among black women than white women has been blamed on the failure of society to provide equal access to prenatal care, but the fact that Chinese American women have lower infant mortality rates than white women, despite not having prenatal care as often, has likewise been passed over in silence. Okay, what did you say here? I saw a good Thomas Sowell quote online earlier. Quote, virtually no idea is too ridiculous to be accepted, even by very intelligent and highly educated people, if it provides a way for them to feel special and important. That is true, and he is dead on. That's one of the reasons I like him so much. Okay, Thank you for bringing that quote in. That's good. That's a good one. All right. Clearly, Asian Americans are an embarrassment to those making the usual arguments for affirmative action. Therefore, Asian Americans are either ignored or are submerged statistically in larger aggregates. These larger aggregates include non whites, where they are swamped by the much larger number of black Americans. More recently, Chinese Americans and Japanese Americans have been lumped together with Samoans, Hawaiians, Vietnamese, and others under the omnibus category Asian and Pacific Islanders, whose heterogeneity is suggested by the fact that Japanese Americans have nearly double the income of Samoans, as well as incomes higher than that of white Americans. This burying of inconvenient facts in heterogeneous statistical aggregates is not peculiar to the United States. In Canada, the popular omnibus category is visible minorities, submerging the highly successful Japanese minority there in a category with less successful minorities. In Britain, people of Chinese ancestry are submerged in the omnibus category black, as are Indians, Pakistanis, and others. These are just some of the ways words are used to obscure evidence that could be dangerous to clarify from the standpoint of those defending the social vision behind affirmative action. A study in New Zealand says, quote, bitter resentment of Asian immigrant success is expressed, end quote, in a government document from the Maori Development, Development Ministry. Sorry, stumbling a bit there. In all these countries, the facts about Asian success are a deadly threat to the social vision used to explain away the failures of others and to claim preferential treatment as compensation for the presumed failures of society. An official report titled Ethno-Racial Inequality in the City of Toronto declares, quote, combining all the non-European groups, the family poverty rate is 34.3% more than twice the figure for Europeans and Canadians, end quote. In other words, this is presented as a racial difference by lumping together, quote, all the non-European groups, end quote. But a detailed breakdown of the family poverty rates of the many European and non-European groups shows that Canadians of Japanese ancestry in Toronto have poverty rates lower than those of Canadians of British, French, German, Polish, or Hungarian ancestry in that city. In classic rhetoric, that evades achievement. The report says, quote, in classic rhetoric that evades achievement, the report says, quote, the Japanese are among the most privileged groups in the city, end quote. Anyone familiar with the history of severe racial discrimination against the Japanese in Canada, including internment during World War II longer than Japanese Americans, must surely regard the word privileged as Orwellian newspeak. I actually was not aware that the Canadians put the Japanese in internment camps just like America did. I did not know that. This is news. It is much the same story when it comes to median family income in Toronto. The median family income for people of British ancestry living in Toronto is above the median family income for the city as a whole, but that of Japanese Canadians in Toronto is above that of the British. Among the many other differences among various groups in Toronto are differences in the percentage of their families which include couples rather than single parents. 41% among blacks and 91% among Japanese, and in how recently they arrived in Canada, as well as in their median ages, their knowledge of English, and other factors. Clearly, those who lump together visible minorities, quote unquote, in Canada are able to bury social differences that are highly relevant and empirical evidence that is highly inconvenient for those attempting to explain differences in group success by racial discrimination. Nothing has been more common in countries around the world and other and over centuries of recorded history than large disparities in the success or failure of different groups. Whether these groups have been of the same color or a different color, the attempt to ascribe the same phenomenon in particular countries today to barriers against non-whites must not only ignore all this history but also bury the facts about Asian minorities statistically. Intergroup relations. Among the most remarkable rationales for group preferences and quotas is the claim that such things promote a more cohesive society. National unity being a popular phrase in India, Malaysia, and Nigeria, for example. Despite a history of increasing, excuse me, despite a history of Oh, damn it. I lost my place. Despite a history of increasing intergroup resentments, polarization, violence, and even civil war in the wake of such policies in a number of countries, nor are India, Malaysia, and Nigeria the only countries where affirmative action is promoted as a means of better intergroup relations. The actual track record of group identity politics is in sharp contrast with the mystical benefits of diversity, quote unquote, endlessly asserted but seldom tested empirically and never proved. In India, for example, the number of people killed in intergroup violence during the decade of the 1980s was 4 times as high as in the 1970s. In Nigeria, the phrase national unity has appeared repeatedly in official pronouncement justifying group preferences even as members of different tribes slaughter each other before, during, and after that country's civil war. Despite incessant repetition of the word diversity and sweeping dogmas about its social benefits, countries that have suffered the intergroup strife which has so often accompanied the politicization of intergroup differences have then gone to great trouble to try to create enclaves of homogeneity as a means of reducing internal strife. Both India and Nigeria have split existing states or provinces into smaller political units in which some former minority group can become a majority. In short, those who have suffered the most severe consequences of group identity politics have then turned to local reduction of diversity as a way to diffuse polarization and violence. A related and equally unsubstantiated assumption is that disparities in income and wealth promote intergroup strife. As a corollary, reductions in such disparities are assumed to reduce resentments and the hostility and violence growing out of such resentments. Seldom, if ever, is this widespread belief subjected to empirical scrutiny. Among the countries studied here, all the evidence points in the opposite direction. In Malaysia, Nigeria, and Sri Lanka, there was far less intergroup violence in the first half of the 20th century when intergroup disparities were greater, and far more violence after these disparities had been politicized and group identity politics promoted. In the United States as well, the worst ghetto riots occurred during the administrations which most sympathetically publicized and dramatized the grievances of blacks, especially the administration of President Lyndon Johnson. Moreover, such riots declined abruptly with the election of Richard Nixon as president, and major ghetto riots became virtually unknown during the 8 years of the Reagan administration, when group identity politics were ignored or frowned upon. Uh, Welcome in, Deglamong. Let's see, where was I? Frowned upon. Here again was the same pattern found in other countries where it was not disparities but the politicization of those disparities and the promotion of group identity politics which was the harbinger of intergroup hostility and violence. Other countries not covered here show similar patterns. The Volga Germans in Russia coexisted peacefully for more than a century with their Russian neighbors, despite the greater productivity and prosperity of these Germans. But this prosperous minority became targeted as exploiters after the Bolshevik Revolution and suffered spoliation and violence. Indians, Pakistanis, and Lebanese likewise lived peacefully for years among Africans whose economic level did not approach their own until political demagogues made Asians targets of envy, resentment, discrimination, and violence. It was much the same story with Indians in Fiji, Jews in Germany, Armenians in Turkey, and other groups in other places. A study of group preferences and quotas in Pakistan concluded, quote, paradoxically, Pakistan's redistribution policies have been effective in increasing ethno-regional proportionality, but they have done little to restrict or in some cases have served to enhance the level of ethno-regional conflict in the state, end quote. Such conflict escalated to the point of civil war when East Pakistan seceded to become the new nation of Bangladesh. Those who imagine themselves to be promoting intergroup harmony by attempting to reduce economic disparities between groups seldom consider whether their politicizing of those differences may have the opposite effect. What has actually happened seems to carry far less weight than what prevailing theories say will happen, nor is this just a matter of political spin. It was not a cynical politician in India, but an earnest American scholar who had researched affirmative action programs there who said, quote, the compensatory discrimination policy is not to be judged only for its instrumental qualities. It is also expressive. Through it, Indians tell themselves what kind of people they are and what kind of nation. These policies express a sense of connection and shared destiny. End quote. This was said about a policy which has repeatedly provoked riots in which dozens or even hundreds of people have been killed. The, quote, altruistic fraternal impulse that animates compensatory policies, end quote, was given much credit by this scholar despite the age-old warning that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. India's most intolerant and violent mass movement, Shiv Sena, began as an organization seeking preferences preferences and quotas for Maharashtrians in Bombay. The granting of those quotas only boosted Shiv Sena's standing and power. Moreover, its success in exploiting group identity led it to defend its constituency against an ever-growing list of enemies, quote-unquote, Tamils, Muslims, Christians, foreigners, among others, both politically and violently in the streets, just as preferences and quotas tend to spread over time to new groups and new activities, so success at group identity politics tends to expand the list of grievances and enemies, quote-unquote, necessary to keep the movement viable and its leaders powerful. The progression of India's Shiv Sena movement to ever wider circles of enemies and ever more expansive notions of grievances is instructive. At first, the enemy was primarily people from South India living in Bombay who were more economically successful than the indigenous Maharashtrians. However, a series of concessions on that issue only whetted the movement's appetite for more concessions on more things and for ever more grievances to keep its followers aroused and combat ready. Muslims were then targeted in a campaign climaxed by lethal riots and atrocities in 1992 and 1993. According to the Times of India, there were mobs, quote, stopping vehicles and setting passengers ablaze, end quote, and, quote, men brought bleeding to hospital who were knived to fresh, as well as neighbors leading longtime friends to gory deaths, and women who had seen their children thrown into fires, husbands hacked, daughters molested, sons dragged away, end quote, while more than 100,000 people fled Bombay. India's different groups do not have the geographical separation that facilitates civil war, as in Sri Lanka or Nigeria, but clearly the hatred and violence have been very similar. The ever-expanding list of enemies or targets grew to include foreigners in general and those Indians who followed foreign customs, such as celebrating Valentine's Day. Shops selling Valentine's cards had their windows smashed by thugs. Shiv Sena warned that it would not tolerate foreign ownership of Air India or the playing of a cricket match between India and Pakistan in Bombay. Moreover, the success of Shiv Sena has inspired other xenophobic movements in other parts of India. Attempts to appease or neutralize these movements with concessions have been largely unsuccessful and may well have contributed to their continued growth and escalating virulence. What a movement needs for its own survival is not a set of concessions won in the past, though these may be celebrated, but an inventory of demands still outstanding, grievances still unassuaged, and enemies, quote unquote, still to be dealt with. This is as true of American protest movements as of group identity movements in India. Things have not reached the same stage of violent hostility in the United States, but neither has affirmative action existed as long in American society. Nevertheless, a very similar pattern of ever more extremist group identity politics and grievance politics can be seen in the United States, moving in the same general direction of ever expanding enemies, quote unquote, ever expanding demands, and ever more bitter polarization. And boy, are we on that path right now. The first demands of black civil rights movements were for equal opportunity in the plain and straightforward sense of being treated just like everyone else. Only after that goal was clearly within reach did the new demand for preferential treatment arise. Then it was decades after black protest movements began demanding and receiving preferential treatment that demands for reparations for the slavery of centuries past became a major campaign. Black protest movements' initial enemies, segregationist whites in the South, have expanded over the years to include Korean and Vietnamese shopkeepers in the ghettos, whose deaths in riots are virtually ignored by much of the media, lest they be accused of being racist in their reporting. The idea that affirmative action promotes good relations among groups remains central to the defense of that policy in the United States and is implicit in the endlessly repeated word diversity. The Bowen-Bach study of the effects of affirmative action in colleges and universities credits this program with the fact that 56% of white students in the institutions studied report knowing two or more black classmates well, despite the fact that 86% of whites in American society at large report having black friends and 54% report having 5 or more black friends. Diversity has added nothing. On the contrary, a number of elite American colleges and universities have had reports of growing racial hostility among their students during the affirmative action era. The more plausible sounding claim that, quote, the cumulative structural character of inequality means that a regime of formal equality tends to perpetuate disparities we find intolerable, end quote, likewise ignores a very large body of history about groups who began in lowly positions and then rose to levels above the level of the average member of the larger society. Jewish, Chinese, Lebanese, Indian, Japanese, German, Italian, and other immigrants have done this in countries around the world. In 20th century America, so many individuals rose from the bottom 20% in income to the top 20% within their own lifetimes, indeed within a decade, that the very notion of a class becomes open to serious question in this context, when there is such rapid turnover of individuals in given income brackets. The idea that one can automatically read the injustices of the past in the disparities of the present becomes ludicrous in light of all the minorities in numerous countries who have prospered more than the respective majority populations of those countries within any ability to discriminate against those majorities, and often despite those majorities, continued discriminations against them. It would be very convenient if the present so neatly recapitulated the past, but the facts have been uncooperative. None of this denies that some groups, untouchables in India, blacks in the United States, have not only experienced large scale and long sustained discrimination, but have also been held back by it, even if we cannot quantify how much. What the larger picture says, however, is that we cannot automatically call group preferences and quotas compensation for past discrimination, nor can we credit it with reducing violence arising out of resentments about past discrimination. Preceding chapters have shown time and again intergroup violence arising from majority groups that no one has discriminated against, and preferences and quotas being given such groups whose only real problem has been their inability to compete with more skilled or more diligent minorities. Nor have either untouchables or blacks been more violent when they were most discriminated against. Poetic justice might have justified such a consequence, but poetic justice does not necessarily prevail. Often the claim is made that benign preferences are very different from the kind of racial discrimination found in the American South during the Jim Crow era, or apartheid in white-ruled South Africa, or the anti-Semitism of the Nazi era. But all group preferences are benign to those who benefit, and malign to those who pay the price. The exclusion of blacks from Major League Baseball before Jackie Robinson broke the color line in 1947 was undoubtedly benign to many white ball players who would otherwise never have gotten out of the minor leagues if they had had to compete for jobs with such stars of the old Negro leagues as Satchel Paige and Josh Gibson. Was it benign that so many Aryans were able to get prestigious positions vacated by Japanese scholars and scientists who fled Nazi Germany? Even looking beyond preferential policies, most of the harms and horrors inflicted on people throughout history were inflicted so that somebody else could benefit. All were benign if one looks only at the effects on the beneficiaries. Empirical evidence on affirmative action. The prominence of semantic issues in controversies over affirmative action policies in various countries reflects, in part, a shortage of empirical evidence with which to test policies and beliefs about their consequences. For example, after many years of affirmative action policies in favor of New Zealand's Maori minority, a Wellington newspaper reported in November 2000, quote, "Extraordinarily, there appears to be little or no research into whether teaching kids the standard curriculum but in Maori has improved their educational outcomes." End quote. The paper adds, quote, "Nobody knows because nobody seems to be asking." End quote. Excuse me. Unfortunately, such disinterest in empirical consequences is not confined to New Zealand. In the United States, where many group preferences have sought to justify themselves as counterweights to discrimination that would otherwise prevail, such discrimination, quote unquote, often turns out to be statistical underrepresentation, quote unquote, in desirable occupations or institutions. The implicit assumption tenaciously held is that great statistical disparities in demographic representation could not occur without discrimination. This key assumption is seldom tested against data on group disparities in qualifications. For example, as of the year 2001, there were more than 16,000 Asian American students who scored above 700 on the mathematics SAT, while fewer than 700 black students scored that high, even though blacks outnumbered Asian Americans several times over. Data such as these are simply passed over in utter silence or are drowned out by strident assertions of covert discrimination as explanations of a dearth of blacks in institutions and occupations requiring a strong background in mathematics. False beliefs are not small things because they lead to false solutions. In the field of medicine, it has long been recognized that even a false cure that is wholly harmless in itself can be catastrophic in its consequences if it substitutes for a real cure for a deadly disease. Proponents of affirmative action cannot console themselves for their false assumptions on grounds that their intentions were good, because social quackery likewise substitutes for real efforts to deal with real problems that can tear society apart. Despite an orientation of asking what we can do for them, those who want to see blacks advance in fields requiring a mathematics background need to confront black students with a need to master this subject, even if that means giving up other diversions and giving up attitudes that doing academic work is acting white. This will win few friends and fewer votes, but the question is whether one is serious about results for others or simply wants to feel good about oneself. Ain't that the truth? The strongest moral case for affirmative action policies is in a country like India, where individuals are born, live, and die in the same caste. Yet that case is remarkably weak even in India. If one judges affirmative action by its actual consequences rather than by its ideals, rationales, or hopes, period. However, in India, as in other countries around the world, such policies are usually not judged by their empirical consequences, either by most intellectuals or by most politicians. When judged by what actually happens, what is wrong with affirmative action is even clearer in India than in the United States or in other countries, simply because of the way official statistics are collected there. American government data are collected in broad brush categories such as blacks, whites, and Hispanics. The parallels in India would be the four Varnas of the Hindu religion: Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaisyas, and Sudras. I know I butchered those. But these broad idealized categories, which apply all across India, are not the socially relevant functional groups in which people actually live, interact socially, and marry in their own communities. These later groups are called jatis, and there are thousands of them in the many communities scattered across the vast reaches of India. The term caste has been applied to both varnas and jatis, but statistical data are available for the latter. The availability of official statistics broken down more finely in India than in the United States has enormous implications. It means that data can be discussed. Excuse me. Wow. It means that data can be discussed in much more specific terms in India than in the broad brush categories used in the U.S. In India, the effects of affirmative action policies can be traced not just to such a general category as untouchables or Dalits, but more specifically to Chamars in Maharashtra or Haryana or Madhya Pradesh as compared to other jatis in the same broad category of untouchables in those states. That is how we know that the more fortunate of the untouchables, or Dalits, receive the lion's share of the benefits, or how the creamy layer quote unquote, tends to get a disproportionate share of preferential benefits in other groups. One cannot discover from U.S. government statistics how much of the benefits of affirmative action go to West Indian blacks or to those blacks who are descendants of the, quote, free persons of color, end quote, who were freed before the Civil War, even though other studies show that these subgroups have had very different histories from the history of most other blacks. Such data as can be gleaned from the variety of private sources in the United States suggest that the more fortunate American blacks receive a disproportionate share of the benefits going to blacks as a whole in the United States, just as the more fortunate Malays tend to benefit most from affirmative action in Malaysia, or the more fortunate untouchables benefit from affirmative action in India. But this is not so massively demonstrated statistically as in India. So while the moral case for affirmative action is stronger in India, the empirical case is weaker because so few of the poorer untouchable groups benefit, and the more fortunate, quote, other background classes, end quote, receive far more than all the untouchables put together. That is because these quote unquote other backward classes are more numerous and because they are usually in a better position to take advantage of preferences and quotas, since they are more likely to have more of the complementary resources required. In the United States, there is not yet such widespread awareness as in India of how preferential programs for the less fortunate end up helping disproportionately the more fortunate, and therefore there are no comparable political or legal issues about the creamy layer, quote unquote. He used that term several times in the chapter on India. That the creamy layer comment, I mean. Neither in India nor elsewhere are affirmative action policies simply a matter of redistributing benefits. Such programs also generate major social costs which fall on the population as a whole. Losses of efficiency are among these costs, whether because less qualified persons are chosen over more qualified persons, or because many highly qualified members of non-preferred groups emigrate from a society where their chances have been reduced. However, the cost of inefficiency is overshadowed by the cost of intergroup polarization, violence, and loss of lives. Bloody and lethal riots over affirmative action in India are the most obvious examples, but there have also been young Brahmins who have died by setting themselves on fire in protest against policies which have destroyed their prospects. As the country which has had preferences and quotas for the less fortunate longer than any other, India presents clearest historical picture of their consequences as well as the clearest statistical picture. Its history is not one to encourage other countries to follow in India's footsteps, much less the footsteps of Sri Lanka. The history of Sri Lanka is even more chilling to those who are concerned about what actually happens in the wake of affirmative action policies, as distinguished from what was expected or hoped would happen. Sri Lanka's well-deserved reputation as a country with exemplary relations between its majority and minority populations in the middle of the 20th century has become a bitter mockery in the course of a decades-long civil war marked by hideous atrocities. Despite Sri Lanka's being a much smaller country than the United States, the number of Sri Lankans who have died in its internal strife exceeds the number of Americans killed during the long years of the Vietnam War. The history of blacks in the United States has been virtually stood on its head by those advocating affirmative action. The empirical evidence is clear that most blacks got themselves out of poverty in the decades preceding the Civil Rights Revolution of the 1960s and the beginning of affirmative action in the 1970s. Yet the political misrepresentation of what happened by leaders and friends of blacks has been so pervasive that this achievement has been completely submerged in the public consciousness. Instead of gaining the respect that other groups have gained by lifting themselves out of poverty, blacks are widely seen by friends and critics alike as owing their advancement to government beneficence. When the black community itself, the po- I'm sorry, within, wow, okay, I'm stumbling a bit. Within the black community itself, the possible ending of affirmative action has been portrayed as a threat to end their economic and social progress. Thus, whites are resentful and blacks are fearful because of policies which have in fact done relatively little on net balance to help blacks in general or poor blacks in particular. Among black students in colleges and universities, those admitted under lower standards face a higher failure rate, and those admitted under the same standards as other students graduate with their credentials under a cloud of suspicion because of double standards for minority students in general. One of the most widely used defenses of group preferences and quotas is that there are precedents for them. In college admissions, for example, there have been preferences for athletes and for alumni children. Merit criteria have not been universal in other institutions either. Why then the objections to racial or ethnic preferences or preferences for women? As a strategic argument, this arbitrarily puts the burden of proof on critics of affirmative action, as if the demonstrable social costs of this program needed no justification. But of all justifications, precedent is one of the weakest. Everything that has been done wrong, from jaywalking to genocide, has had precedents. Any justification or criticism of affirmative action must be based on its actual consequences. If we took the argument from precedents as conclusive, then nothing could ever be corrected until there was perfection in everything else. Verbal parallels are not enough. Hard evidence on the magnitude or empirical consequences of such things as alumni preferences is needed, but is seldom asked for or given. No one, for example, asks how far below the usual admission standards are the alumni children who are admitted preferentially, compared to how much the standards are lowered to get the racial profile required for diversity, quote unquote. There is, however, some empirical evidence on the consequences of preferential admissions of individuals from privileged groups. When the president of the University of the Philippines had discretionary powers to admit particular students without regard to the usual academic criteria, the results were that 1. The great majority admitted this way were offspring of the rich and powerful, and 2. Quote, those admitted by presidential discretion performed worse than the rest of the audience, end quote. At Harvard, back during the era when more than half of all alumni sons were admitted, those special admittees were disproportionately represented among students who flunked out. Despite verbal parallels between affirmative action and preferences for the privileged, when some rich student of modest ability does not make it through an elite college, that is neither a personal nor a social tragedy, given the range of options still available to that student. But with students from a lower income background for whom education may be their one shot at a better life, the story is entirely different. Okay. Um, I'm going to finish this next 2 paragraphs, and then I'm just going to step away just long enough to refill my water. Not actually taking a break because we're only about 6 pages from the end of the chapter, but I can feel it. My throat is wanting to give out, so I need the water. So the last 2 paragraphs here real quick. As for the important question of how much of a preference exists, that is, how far below the usual admission standards are alumni children versus minority children admitted through racial preferences, a child of modest ability from a wealthy family is likely to have had the best education that money can buy, but his academic preparation and test scores are likely to be solid, even if not outstanding. But a minority youngster admitted to a college where the other students have composite scores hundreds of points higher faces a much tougher prospect. If the only issue is affirmative action were whether there are any other unmerited benefits, then arguments about the preferential admissions of the children of affluent alumni might make some sense. But when the consequences of racial or ethnic quotas include creating artificial failures among the ostensible beneficiaries and polarization in the society at large, then mere verbal parallels are not enough. Okay, so that's the end of those two. I'm going to just go refill my water and I will be right back.
Welcome to a whole new world. Your planet is now under Mid-Ranger's control. Humanity will be exterminated. If you hear this message, do not try to leave. Do not try to fight. Do not try to resist. You will be eliminated. You will be eliminated.
Okay, let's go ahead and finish this up. We will. We've only got a few pages left here. So, all right, misleading tactics. One of the unquantifiable but by no means unimportant consequences of affirmative action has been a widespread dishonesty taking many forms. The redesignation of individuals and groups in order to receive the benefits of preferences and quotas intended for others has been common in various countries. In the United States, a special dishonesty has been necessary to square group preferences and quotas with the requirement of the American Constitution for equal rights among individuals. This has involved both concealment of the existence of preferential treatment and claims that such treatment is only a remedial response to existing discrimination. This adds insults to people's intelligence, to the injuries they may have received or perceived themselves as receiving, and can only add to the backlash. There is all the difference in the world between saying that you have not had an even chance in life and saying that a particular individual or institution with whom you dealt has discriminated against you. Another widespread kind of dishonesty in both India and the United States is the use of hazy, unverifiable criteria to conceal group preferences in college and university admissions by automatically offsetting the better academic records of members of one group with higher leadership and other subjective rankings of membership of members of other groups who would be inadmissible in competition with others on academic grounds. In both countries, court decisions restricting the scope or terms of group preferences in admissions to colleges and universities have been followed by efforts to put a greater emphasis on non-academic criteria in admissions. As noted in Chapter 2, the ranking of students on these non-academic criteria in India has almost invariably turned out to be higher for those with lower academic records and lower for those with higher academic Oh, what? Oh, it's a typo. It repeated itself. Did you look into any Charles Murray books? I did look into them. I looked through what I have, and I do not have any of them. So I'm gonna pick some up. Um, like the bell curve is the one you were asking, or that you were mentioning the other night, I think. I'm gonna pick that one up and look through some of the others. Let's see. In the United States, nebulous factors like leadership or overcoming adversity have likewise served as automatic offsets whose validity or lack of validity is not subject to proof or disproof. State bans on affirmative action in California and Texas public universities set off a wave of creative proposals for non-objective criteria for admissions, echoing what had happened in India decades before, where the state government of Mysore, it's Mysore, quote, suddenly exhibited an enhanced concern for the extracurricular accomplishments of applicants to professional colleges, end quote. Nothing is easier than to come up with rationales for non-objective criteria. In India's state of Madras, for example, one supporter of such criteria argued that such criteria would, quote, eliminate puny creatures with no personality from becoming engineers and doctors, end quote. One of the common dishonesties in the academic world is faculty rejection of affirmative action in anonymous polls and supporting of it when voting publicly in faculty meetings or commenting in the media. A 1996 Roper poll, for example, found that a majority of professors nationwide were opposed to affirmative action in faculty hiring and to affirmative action in student admissions. Yet it is virtually impossible to find a faculty vote against these policies in American colleges and universities. Bitter fights have erupted over the issue of using secret ballots for votes on this issue, since both sides have recognized that whether the voting was secret or public could lead to opposite results. History itself has been misrepresented as a way of strengthening the case for particular policies. Such misrepresentations of the history of the rise of blacks and women in the United States have already been noted in Chapter 6. The history of the Aboriginal population in Australia has also been misrepresented in the quest for more current government benefits. In country after country, deception has been an integral part of the case for affirmative action. One of the most common forms of deception is the use of rationales which bear little or no relationship to what has actually been done. No sufferings by black Americans, past or present, can justify admitting white students to an elite San Francisco public high school over better qualified Chinese American students who applied. Yet, once a policy of racial quotas has been authorized, the floodgates have been opened to such things wholly at odds with the rationales for these quotas. Emotionally powerful and politically explosive issues often produce desperate searches for a third way to resolve dilemmas without confronting realities. Some even flatter themselves that this represents a more subtle and nuanced approach. But however subtle and nuanced one's thinking may be, ultimately thinking must confront a reality where options can be few, crude, and discrete. Given the tenacity with which group preferences and quotas have persisted, and the zeal with which they have been expanded in countries around the world, subtleties in trying to perform or reduce trying to reform or reduce affirmative action can amount to little more than a verbal fig leaf over the naked continuance of the same policies as before. Okay, alternatives to affirmative action. Concern for the less fortunate is entirely different from imagining that we can do what we cannot do, nor is the humbling admission of our inherent limitations as human beings a reason for failing to do the considerable number of things which can still be done within those limitations. In America, at least, history has demonstrated dramatically that can be done because it has already been done. Americans need only look back at the beginning of the 20th century to see what enormous social and economic progress has been made by some of the poorest and apparently least promising segments of the population. At the beginning of the 20th century, only about half of the black population of the United States could read and write. Jews lived packed in slums on the Lower East Side of New York, with more overcrowding than in any slums in America today. As late as the First World War, the results of mass mental testing of American soldiers led a leading authority on mental tests to conclude that it was a myth that Jews were highly intelligent. The situation of Chinese Americans looked so hopeless that a popular expression of the time described someone facing impossible odds as having not a Chinaman's chance, quote unquote. Not even most optimists would have predicted at that time how much all these groups would rise over the next half century. Before there were preferences or quotas, even for blacks at the center of current controversies about affirmative action, the decline in their poverty and their rise in the professions were both more dramatic before the federal government created affirmative action in the 1970s. With all these American ethnic groups and others, what happened was not a transfer of benefits from the rest of the population, but a rising contribution from these minorities to the growing prosperity of American society as a whole, from which both they and the larger society benefited, as the less educated became more educated, as farm laborers and domestic servants acquired the skills and experience to take on more challenging work. This was not a zero-sum process, while redistribution is at best a zero-sum process. If it somehow manages to avoid disincentive effects and intergroup turmoil. Why is this social process, with a proven track record, so little appreciated or even noticed, and sometimes dismissed as a policy of doing nothing? Perhaps that is because, whatever its economic and social benefits, it offers few rewards to politicians, activists, and intellectuals, or to those who wish to seem morally superior by denouncing society. The heroes of these groups are anonymous individuals, not public figures. Here is some history worth repeating, but only if the goal is the advancement of the less fortunate, rather than the aggrandizement of those who would be their guardians or spokesmen or elected officials. Summary and implications. The skewed pattern of beneficiaries of affirmative action programs should not only give pause as to the actual consequences of such programs, it should also call into question the very assumption on which affirmative action is based. That assumption is that an uneven distribution of income and of desirable jobs indicates discriminatory intentions toward the less fortunate, which must be counteracted by preferential policies on their behalf. But when those well-intentioned policies show the very same skewed pattern as the presumed ill intentions they are supposed to counteract, then it is hard to avoid the conclusion that something other than intentions must be involved. Nor can behavioral and other differences among the various populations themselves be arbitrarily banished from discussion by some such pat phrases as stereotypes or blaming the victim. Causation is not blame, and whether they are victims or not is precisely the question. Are the Malay majority victims of the Chinese minority in Malaysia, the northern Nigerian majority victims of the Igbo minority, the Sinhalese majority victims of the Tamil minority in Sri Lanka, and numerous local majorities victims of the Chettiar or Marwari minorities in various parts of India? Are the white majorities in Canada and the United States victims of Japanese minorities, or do these minorities simply perform more successfully in the competition of the marketplace and educational institutions? The dogma that statistical disparities demonstrate discrimination assumes an equality of performance that is virtually impossible to find in the real world. Indeed, some of the same groups that are said to be discriminated against on the basis of statistical disparities show the same patterns of statistical dominance over the majority population in such fields as sports and entertainment, fields in which individual talents and efforts can produce success without the kind of cultural prerequisites, such as higher education, required in many other fields. Yet no one seriously believes that Maoris can keep white New Zealanders off that country's sports teams except by outperforming them on the field. Nor can black basketball players in the United States keep white players from hitting home runs. I'm sorry, I said basketball. It's baseball. Wow. Nor can black baseball players in the United States keep white players from hitting home runs, even though 4 of the top 5 totals of career home runs were hit by black players. Statistical disparities prove nothing about discrimination because they are common even in situations where those who are statistically dominant have no way to discriminate. The very modest benefits of affirmative action, concentrated on those already more fortunate with little or no benefits to those who are truly disadvantaged, have often been blamed on insufficient zeal or even bad faith on the part of those administering affirmative action programs. Thus, the failures or inadequacies of such programs can be taken as reasons for reforms rather than as symptoms of more fundamental misconceptions that could be reasons for ending the programs. While this argument might seem plausible to some when discussing whites administering programs for blacks in the United States, it loses even the appearance of plausibility when Malays are administering preferential programs for Malays in Malaysia, or when Sinhalese have administered such programs for Sinhalese in Sri Lanka. Even in the United States, the particular officials heading civil rights agencies such as the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission have almost all been black, as have many or most administrators of affirmative action programs in private industry and in the academic world. Despite a tendency to think of group preferences and quotas as transfers of benefits, a zero-sum process, there are in fact many ways in which these transfers can be negative-sum processes, in which what is lost by one group exceeds what is gained by another, making the society as a whole worse off. For example, when a group in which 80% of the students admitted to college succeed in graduating loses admissions to a group in which only 40% of the students graduate, then the first group must lose 800 graduates in order for the second group to gain 400 graduates. Moreover, it has been common in various countries around the world for groups whose students have lower qualifications to specialize in easier and less remunerative fields, as well as performing less well academically. Therefore, the first group may lose 800 graduates largely concentrated in mathematics, science, and engineering, while the second group gains 400 graduates largely concentrated in sociology, education, and ethnic studies. This does not even take into account the intergroup polarization which group preferences and quotas provoke, and which can take many forms, including lethal riots, as in India, or outright civil war, as in Sri Lanka. By contrast, the gains made by less fortunate groups as a result of becoming better educated and better equipped with skills can be not only a net benefit to society as a whole, but also a source of greater respect for the group by others who see them as becoming more productive, contributing members of society. In the case of blacks in the United States, much of their advancement has been of this sort, but the existence of affirmative action and of particular horror stories growing out of it has meant that blacks' actual achievements have often been underestimated or disregarded. Affirmative action has meant almost a moratorium on recognition of the achievements of those designated as its beneficiaries, however little tangible benefits these groups may in fact have received. Another way in which affirmative action can be a negative-sum process is by a withdrawal of members of non-preferred groups and the loss of their contributions to the society at large. A study of preferential policies in Malaysia reports the, quote, emigration of non-Bumiputera professionals and the outflow of Chinese capital, end quote. In post-apartheid South Africa, with affirmative action for blacks, many white government workers have taken early retirement and thousands of whites have emigrated annually. Those on the wrong side of preferential policies. Oh, and we're in an ad. Damn it, Jim. We're almost there, but that's okay. We'll let this ad run, um, and I will start at in post-apartheid South Africa. That'll be as good a place as any. And what do we have? An ad for food stores and now cars. Ford, of course. Okay, whatever. All right, so we've got 5 seconds left. Okay, so it says that we're back. So I'm going to start back here. In post-apartheid South Africa, with affirmative action for blacks and many white government workers have taken early retirement and thousands of whites have emigrated annually. Those on the wrong side of preferential policies have likewise emigrated from Fiji, from Soviet Central Asia, from East Africa, and from other places where the skills and experience of these emigrants were sorely needed. Excuse me. The empirical consequences of affirmative action, preferences, and quotas have been paid remarkably little attention, with hard data being sparse to non-existent in some countries, while controversies surrounding these policies have been discussed in terms of the vision and the rationale behind them, and the counter-vision and counter-rationales of critics. Vague, emotional, confused, and dishonest words, which are incidental aspects of many controversial issues, are central to discussions of affirmative action in countries around the world. Few such programs could stand on the basis of their actual empirical consequences. Nor are their moral bases any more solid. Some groups in some countries imagine themselves entitled to preferences and quotas just because they are indigenous, sons of the soil, quote unquote, even when they are in fact not indigenous, as the Sinhalese in Sri Lanka and the Malays in Malaysia are not. Yet indigenousness has acquired a moral aura, not only among those claiming such status, but among observers and scholars as well. Why an accident of history and geography should have moral implications that last for centuries is a question seldom raised, much less answered. Even when serious moral questions surround the past or present mistreatment of groups such as the Untouchables in India or blacks in the United States, the remedies proposed rapidly spread far beyond redress of the misfortunes used to justify those remedies. Not only has the internal distribution of compensatory benefits borne little relationship, or even an inverse relationship, to the degree of misfortune within the affected groups, such benefits have spread to other groups far beyond the scope of the moral rationale and far exceeding in size the intended beneficiary groups. Innumerable principles, theories, assumptions, and assertions have been used to justify affirmative action programs. Some common around the world and some peculiar to particular countries or communities. What is remarkable is how seldom these nations have been tested empirically or have even been defined clearly or examined logically, much less weighed against the large and often painful costs they entail. Despite sweeping claims made for affirmative action programs, an examination of their actual consequences makes it hard to support those claims or even to say that these programs have been beneficial on net balance, unless one is prepared to say that any amount of social redress, however small, is worth any amount of costs and dangers, however large. And that is the end of the book. Woo! As usual, there's about 60 pages of just notes. Of course, I'm not going to read that. If you want to read the notes, you'll have to pick up the book yourself and go through it and read the notes in context. But that is that. So now it's time to figure out the next book, and I've already pretty much settled on it. It's one that's been on the list for a while, so I'm not even sure where the heck it is right at the moment. I have it here. I know it's here. Just have to figure out what I did with it. I just saw it. I think if it's, I have this one in hard copy, I believe. So anyway, I will be starting it. It's a book on the Masons and their origins. So that's what I'll be getting into for the next book. And I'm going to look into the Charles Murray books a bit more. I did look at them last night when we were discussing it on your stream, Vesper. But like I said, I don't have any of them. I need to pick some up. So anyway, that'll be that. I am not going to raid anybody tonight. I'm just going to bid you all a good night, and I will see you in the next stream, which will be Friday, starting the new book for this occult stream. So have a good night.
Feeling shattered skies, watching teary blue eyes, wonder where I might find some peace of mind. Not lights like I've had, but more sophisticated into love relations. Now disassembling my own heart, 'cause my mind's a million places and giving up. So it's in my head. So tell me it's not happening. Tell me it's not happening. Surrender myself. I feel the world collapsing, but not lights like I've had, but more sophisticated into love relations. Now disassembling my own heart, 'cause my mind's a million places and giving up. So it's in my head. So tell me it's not happening. Tell me it's not happening. Surrender myself. I feel the world collapsing, but it's